I the a-hole for telling my best friend, at his own birthday dinner, that his wife married him for the house.
You went through my wife's phone. Marcus said it flat, no question mark, like he was reading a charge off a police report. We were standing in his garage, the one with his dad's old tools still pegged to the wall in the exact outline his dad had drawn in permanent markers so nothing ever went back in the wrong spot, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that this was the worst possible place to have this conversation, surrounded by wrenches a dead man used to own, in the one room of that house that still smelled faintly like motor oil and Marlboros even though Marcus's dad had been gone 6 years. I didn't go through her phone. She left her laptop open at your birthday dinner and I saw an email Fred, Marcus, I didn't go looking for. You printed it. He held up 6 pages, stapled crooked, my terrible home printer's slightly off margins visible even from 4 feet away. You printed my wife's private correspondence and you brought it to my house like it's a case file. Because it kind of is, Marcus. Read the last page again. Read what he calls her. He didn't read it again. He crumpled it in one hand, 6 pages, crushed into a fist about the size of a softball, and said, "Get out of my garage," in a voice so quiet it scared me more than if he'd shouted, and that was the first time in 19 years of friendship that Marcus felt had ever told me to leave anywhere. I left. I sat in my car in his driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive home, because some stupid part of me kept waiting for the garage door to lift and for him to come jogging out and tell me I was right, that he'd needed someone to show him, that he was glad I'd said something even if it was ugly. He never came out. I finally put the car in reverse with his crumpled pages still sitting on the passenger seat where he'd shoved them back at me, and I drove home replaying the whole thing, trying to figure out at exactly which sentence I'd become the villain of my best friend's story instead of the guy trying to save him from one. So, AITA. Marcus and I have been friends since we were 11 years old, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like a throat clear before a eulogy, and honestly, at several points during this whole mess, it felt like I was rehearsing one. We grew up 2 streets apart in a nothing suburb outside Columbus, the kind of place with one good pizza place and a school district everyone stayed for even after their kids graduated. Marcus's dad, Walt, ran a small HVAC business out of a single truck for the first 10 years and eventually built it into a company with 6 trucks and a couple dozen employees, working himself into an early grave doing it, heart attack at 59, sitting in his recliner, the TV still on when Marcus found him. Walt left Marcus, his only kid, a paid-off house in a solid neighborhood, a decent life insurance payout, and about $340,000 in savings that he'd quietly built up over 3 decades of never spending money on anything he didn't have to. Walt drove the same truck for 11 years. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation until they had holes in the elbows. He was, by every account, a man who treated money like something you accumulated quietly and never, ever talked about at dinner. Marcus didn't touch most of it for years after his dad died. He kept working his own job, he's a mechanical engineer, does structural inspections for a firm downtown, makes solid money on his own, low 6 figures, and treated the inheritance like it belonged to a version of his dad that was still alive somewhere and watching how he spent it. For the first 2 years after Walt passed, Marcus barely moved $1 out of that account except to pay the property taxes on the house. I need you to understand Marcus's personality for any of this to make sense, because none of what happens later makes sense without it. He is, and always has been, almost pathologically loyal and almost pathologically bad at seeing when someone's using him. In 6th grade he lent his entire allowance, like $40, but $40 was a fortune to an 11-year-old in 2003, to a kid named Riley who needed it for his mom's medicine, and never saw $1 of it back. I found out 2 weeks later that Riley had spent it on a Game Boy game, because Riley told half the class, laughing about it. When I told Marcus, his actual response was, well, maybe he really needed it and just felt too ashamed to pay me back, and then he panicked and bought the game to feel better. That is Marcus in one story. He extends the single most charitable possible interpretation to everyone, forever, including people who have given him no reason at all to earn it, and he does it so instinctively that arguing with him about it feels like arguing with someone's religion. This continued into adulthood in smaller, quieter ways. A coworker borrowed his truck for a weekend and put 400 miles on it and never mentioned gas money, and Marcus just shrugged and said the guy was going through a divorce. A cousin hit him up for a short-term loan to cover rent. That was 6 years ago, still unpaid, never brought up by Marcus once. He's not a pushover exactly. He's smart, he's good at his actual job, people respect him at work. It's specifically in his close relationships that he goes soft in a way that other people learn to lean on. He met Renata about 4 years ago at a work conference in Chicago. She does corporate event planning, very polished, very put together, the kind of person who remembers your coffee order after meeting you exactly once, which I used to think was a genuinely nice quality in her before I started thinking of it as a professional skill she'd learned to deploy on people. They dated 8 months, moved in together, got engaged at 11 months, married at 18. I was best man. I gave a speech about loyalty, Marcus's word. Actually, he asked me to build the speech around it, said it was the thing he admired most about our friendship, and people still bring that speech up sometimes, which is a special kind of irony given where we ended up 2 years later. Here's the thing I want to be honest about, because it matters a lot for whether I'm actually the asshole here. I didn't dislike Renata immediately. For the first year or so of the marriage I genuinely thought she was fine. A little image conscious, sure, big on the house looking a certain way for her Instagram, always posting staged photos of dinners she definitely didn't cook, but plenty of people are like that and it's not a character flaw on its own. I've got friends whose spouses are the same way. It didn't ring any alarms for me at first. What changed my read on her happened gradually, in a way that's hard to point to a single moment for. She'd talk about our money in conversation, but it always seemed to specifically mean Marcus's inheritance, not their combined household income, like her own salary was hers to keep separate and quietly build up, while his dad's savings were a shared communal resource that existed to be spent on shared things. I noticed it first at a dinner about a year and a half into the marriage, when she was talking about a kitchen renovation she wanted, and she said, out loud, at the table, well, we have the money, it's just sitting there, in a tone that made it sound like an inconvenience that it hadn't already been spent. The kitchen renovation happened about 18 months into the marriage. It ran to $80,000, almost all of it out of the inheritance account, for a kitchen that, to be fair, is genuinely beautiful. I've been in it. It looks like something out of a magazine, marble countertops, one of those ranges that costs more than my first car. She pushed hard for it, according to Marcus, over a period of a few months, framing it partly as an investment in the house's resale value and partly as something she deserved after putting up with his long work hours the year before, which struck me as a strange thing to frame a kitchen renovation around, but I let it go because it wasn't my marriage. Then there was the car. She talked Marcus into leasing her something that cost more per month than his and mine combined, a car she'd wanted, for confidence, going into a new stretch of client meetings for the event planning business she'd started as a side venture. That business, as far as I could ever tell over the roughly 18 months it existed before quietly fading out of conversation entirely, never actually booked a single paying client. Marcus mentioned once that she'd had a few consultations that didn't convert, and every time I asked a follow-up question about it, the subject changed within about 30 seconds. None of this, individually, is a crime. I want to be fair about that, because I've turned this exact list of facts over in my head roughly 900 times since all of this happened, trying to figure out where exactly the line is between spouse who spends more than I would, and spouse who is systematically draining someone. Plenty of marriages run on one partner earning more, or having more saved, and the household spending reflecting that reality. I know couples where that arrangement is totally healthy and totally mutual. What tipped me from, not my favorite person, but not my business, to actively, quietly worried happened about a year before the birthday dinner, when Marcus mentioned, almost in passing over beers at a Sunday football game, that the inheritance account was down to about $140,000 from the original $340,000. I remember doing the mental math right there on the couch and feeling something cold settle in my stomach. That's more than half of Walt's life savings gone in under 3 years. I asked what it had gone toward. He listed the kitchen, the car lease, some of Renata's business stuff, and then, almost as an afterthought, a family emergency on Renata's side that he was vague about in a way that felt less like discretion and more like he genuinely didn't have the full details himself. I later learned, and this matters a lot, so hold on to it, that this family emergency was not actually what either of us thought it was at the time. I brought my concerns to Marcus twice, gently, over the year leading up to the birthday dinner. Both times he got defensive in that specific soft way he does, not angry, never angry with me, just sort of sad and closed off, like I'd asked him to consider something he physically didn't want to look at. The first time he said, "I trust her, Dale, I don't need you keeping score of my marriage," which stung a little because I hadn't been keeping score, I'd been asking one question. The second time, a few months later, he added, "You've never really liked her, have you?" which stung more, because it wasn't entirely wrong. I hadn't warmed to her the way I'd warmed to other friends' spouses, but it also wasn't the reason I was worried, and I didn't know how to make him hear the difference between not liking someone and not trusting someone with your dead father's life savings. So that's where things stood heading into his 38th birthday dinner. A friend I'd loved for 19 years, a wife I didn't fully trust for reasons I could list but couldn't prove, an inheritance that had lost well over half its value in 3 years, and, waiting for me though I didn't know it yet, a laptop left open at exactly the wrong moment. The birthday dinner was at Marcus and Renata's house, maybe 15 people, fully catered because, in Renata's words, repeated at every gathering she's ever hosted like it's a personality trait instead of a preference, "I don't believe in cooking for your own party, that's what professionals are for." I'd gotten there early to help set up, which is a habit from 19 years of being the friend who shows up early, and I was in the kitchen when Renata came through with a stack of place cards she'd had custom printed, actual calligraphy, for a backyard birthday dinner, and I remember thinking, not unkindly at the time, that it was a lot of production for a Tuesday-adjacent birthday. About 90 minutes into the party, Renata stepped away from the dining table to deal with something in the kitchen, a caterer question, I think, and left her laptop open on the side table where people were setting down drinks. I wasn't snooping. I want to be as honest as I can here even though it costs me some credibility to admit this part. I was looking for a coaster, my beer was sweating onto the wood, and the screen was just there, an email client already open, unlocked, and the subject line visible without me touching a single key, Q3 distribution, need this before the anniversary trip. I should have looked away right there. I didn't. I clicked it open further, one click, that's all it took, the thread was already expanded, and it wasn't really about wealth management at all, or it was, but wrapped tightly around something else entirely. It was a 6-message thread with someone named Trey Osgood, whose email signature read, Osgood Wealth Partners, Senior Advisor, and the tone shifted about 2 messages in from professional to something else. Trey referred to Renata as, babe, in message 3, casually, the way you'd address someone you'd texted 100 times before. Message 5 had Renata writing, in full, still doesn't think there's anything odd about the transfers, he doesn't even look at the statements anymore, I've got this handled, don't worry. Message 6, from Trey, that's my girl, always 3 steps ahead of everyone. I sat with that for the rest of the party like a stone lodged somewhere behind my sternum. I laughed at Marcus's jokes during the toast. I ate cake. I told Renata her calligraphy place cards were a nice touch, which they were, and the whole time I was doing arithmetic in my head about how to say what I'd seen out loud to my best friend without setting his entire life on fire in front of his mother. I didn't say anything to Marcus that night. I know how that sounds, sitting on it through an entire birthday dinner, watching him open presents, watching Renata rest her hand on his shoulder while he cut his own cake because apparently that's a thing they do, but I genuinely didn't trust myself to say it calmly in a room with 15 people in it, including his mother, Deb, and 2 of Renata's co-workers who I'd never met and had no reason to loop into a family crisis. 3 days later I drove to his house, printed pages in hand, and that's the scene you already saw the tail end of. Let me back up about 10 minutes before the part where he told me to get out. I found him alone in the garage. He goes out there most weekends to tinker with an old motorcycle he's been restoring for 6 years and has never actually ridden, a project I've always privately suspected is less about the bike and more about having a reason to stand in a room that still feels like his dad's. And I said, I need to show you something, and I need you to not react until you've read the whole thing. He wiped his hands on a rag, took the pages, and read them standing up, leaning against his dad's old workbench under a pegboard where every tool outline was still labeled in Walt's handwriting. I watched his face do almost nothing while he read, which with Marcus means he's doing everything internally and letting none of it reach the surface. When he finished, he didn't look up right away. He said, quietly, where did you get this? Her laptop was open at your party. You went through my wife's phone. Laptop, I corrected, uselessly, and he didn't care about the correction even slightly. I didn't go looking for it, Marcus, it was right there on the side table, the subject line alone made me. You printed it. That's when the crumpling happened, the fist closing around 6 stapled pages like he could physically compress the problem out of existence. That's when he told me to leave. What I didn't get to say, because he shut the conversation down before I could land it, was the actual point I'd driven over there to make, and I think this distinction matters, even now, even after everything. The Trey stuff, the babe, that was what had grabbed my attention initially, sure, and I'll admit some ugly part of me went straight to the affair read because that's the dramatic, easy read. But the sentence that actually scared me wasn't the flirtation. It was, he doesn't even look at the statements anymore, I've got this handled. That's not a woman describing an affair. That's a woman describing a system, a process, something ongoing and managed. I wanted Marcus to see the difference between me accusing his wife of cheating and me telling him someone might be quietly managing his finances without him watching it happen, and I never got the chance to make that distinction clear before he threw me out of his garage, which meant everything that happened next got built on the version of this where I was the guy who went through his wife's stuff, and not the guy who'd found something that looked, at minimum, like a pattern worth a second. Look. Marcus didn't talk to me for 11 days. 11 days, after 19 years, felt genuinely disorienting. We'd texted almost daily since college, some stupid meme or a, "you watching the game tonight," and the silence had a physical weight to it that I wasn't prepared for. Then Renata called me directly, which I did not expect, ever, for any reason, given that we'd never once had a one-on-one phone conversation in the 4 years I'd known her. She was calm, eerily calm, the kind of calm that's clearly been rehearsed in front of a mirror or, worse, with someone coaching her through what to say, and she opened with, "I think we should clear the air, Dale, for Marcus's sake if nothing else, don't you?" I said I was open to that. She said Trey was, in fact, her financial advisor, that babe was just how he talks to all his clients, unprofessional, sure, but not sinister, and that the line about Marcus not looking at statements was about her trying to protect him from stress during a stretch where his dad's estate taxes had gotten unexpectedly complicated, and she'd been handling the boring parts, so he didn't have to carry that on top of his actual job. She said it all smoothly, evenly, like a woman reciting a paragraph she'd rehearsed in the shower that morning. I didn't believe her, but I also couldn't disprove a single sentence of it in the moment, which is its own kind of trap. I sat there on the phone half agreeing with things I didn't actually believe just to keep the conversation from turning into a shouting match, and I hung up afterward feeling like I'd lost some kind of point I couldn't quite name. Then Marcus's mother, Deb, called me, and Deb has never once, in 19 years, called me on the phone. We communicate exclusively through Marcus, always have, a running family joke about how Deb thinks phone calls are for emergencies and grandmothers. So the call itself, before she'd said a single word, told me exactly how far this had already traveled through the family. Deb said, without any preamble, "I heard what you did, and honestly, thank God someone finally did it, because I've had a bad feeling about that girl since the rehearsal dinner and nobody in this family will let me say it out loud." That's the first time I found out I wasn't the only one who'd been quietly worried for years. Deb told me she'd tried, twice, to bring up her own concerns to Marcus over the course of the marriage, once about the kitchen renovation, once about a loan Renata had apparently gotten from Walt's old business partner, a man named Kurt who'd co-signed some equipment financing back in Walt's HVAC days and who, according to Deb, had never seen a dollar of that loan repaid and had quietly stopped coming to family events over it. Both times Deb had brought it up, Marcus had shut the conversation down almost exactly the way he'd shut mine down in the garage. "He does that," Deb said, and I could hear something tired and old in her voice, like she'd made peace with this pattern in her son a long time ago. He'd rather believe the best of somebody forever than sit with the discomfort of finding out he was wrong about them. His father was the same way, actually, until the day he wasn't. I asked what she meant by that last part. She said Walt had gotten burned badly, once, decades earlier, by a business partner who'd skimmed money off the HVAC company for almost 2 years before Walt caught it, and that Walt's response, once he found out, hadn't been anger. It had been this quiet, devastating withdrawal, cutting the man out of his life completely and never speaking his name again, no confrontation, no scene. Marcus doesn't know how to do the middle version, Deb told me. He either doesn't see it at all, or he sees it and just disappears the person. There's no version where he yells and works it out. That's not in him. There was, inevitably, a family group chat, Marcus's side, which I've been included in since roughly college because I've been treated like an honorary felt for most of my adult life, and it detonated over the course of a single weekend once word got around. Marcus's cousin Priyanka, who works in forensic accounting of all professions, offered to take a professional look at whatever documentation existed, which I thought was a genuinely useful, low-drama offer, and which Marcus, when he eventually scrolled through the thread, apparently read as the entire family ganging up on his wife behind her back without his consent. Marcus's Uncle Ray, who has opinions about everything and absolutely no filter installed for any of them, wrote something like, "Some women marry a man's bank account, not the man, always have, always will, learned that the hard way myself," which was unhelpful, reductive, borderline offensive, and also exactly the kind of comment that made the whole thread feel less like a careful, concerned intervention and more like a pile-on, which I think genuinely hurt Marcus worse than the original financial questions ever did. He told Deb, at one point, that reading Ray's message made him feel like everyone had already put Renata on trial and sentenced her before I even got a vote, and honestly, reading it back now, I think he had a real point buried in that complaint, even if I disagreed with his conclusion. Here's the tangent, the true aside, because there's always one. In the middle of all this, my own wife, Ines, who has met Renata maybe 6 times total over 4 years and has always been polite but carefully neutral about her, the way you're neutral about a coworker's spouse you don't know well, told me something I'd never heard before. At Marcus and Renata's wedding, in the bathroom of all places, waiting in line during cocktail hour, Renata had turned to Ines, a near stranger at that point, and asked, completely out of nowhere, whether the house Marcus's dad left him was actually in his name alone or if it'd go to probate weird since his mom's still alive. Ines had thought it was a strange, oddly specific thing to ask a stranger in a bathroom line at your own wedding reception, and had genuinely forgotten about it for 4 years until this whole mess dragged the memory back up unprompted one night while we were doing dishes. She hadn't mentioned it to me at the time because it had seemed so minor, a weird one-off comment, nothing worth repeating. It didn't feel minor anymore. It felt, when she finally told me, like the first data point in a pattern that had actually started before the wedding even happened. By the end of that weekend, Marcus had gone completely dark on the family chat, not a single message, not even a scene indicator anyone could point to, and I started to genuinely worry that I triggered something that was going to cost him not just his marriage, but his relationship with his entire family, over information I still wasn't 100% sure I'd even interpreted correctly. There's one more piece of that weekend I haven't told anyone outside of Ines, because it doesn't reflect well on me and I've had to sit with that. Sunday night, after 2 days of radio silence from Marcus and an inbox full of increasingly heated family chat notifications, I drove past his house. Not stopped, not knocked, just drove past, slow, at almost 11 at night, like some kind of amateur detective, because I'd convinced myself I needed to know if Renata's car was in the driveway or if things had already escalated to her leaving. Her car was there. The porch light was on. I sat at the stop sign at the end of his street for probably 90 seconds longer than any stop sign requires, and then I drove home and didn't tell Ines what I'd done until almost a week later, because even in the moment some part of me knew it was a strange, slightly unhinged thing to have done, and I was embarrassed by how invested I'd become in a marriage that wasn't mine. Ines, to her credit, didn't make me feel worse about it than I already felt. She just said, "You've been carrying this like it's your marriage falling apart, not his. You need to figure out where the line is between being a good friend and needing to be right." I didn't have a good answer for her then. I'm not sure I have one now either, if I'm being fully honest about it. Monday morning, Mark from work, no relation to Marcus, just a coincidence of names that caused constant confusion in group texts for years, asked me offhand at the coffee machine if everything was okay, because apparently I'd been staring at my phone in the break room for 10 straight minutes without moving. I told him it was nothing. It was, obviously, not nothing. I just didn't have a version of the story short enough for a coffee machine conversation, and I'm not sure I have one now, 6 weeks later, either. About 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, Priyanka called me directly. She'd apparently kept digging quietly, on her own time, after the group chat blew up, using nothing but publicly available business filings, nothing illegal, nothing that required access to anyone's private accounts, just the kind of paper trail an accountant knows how to pull with a laptop in an afternoon. Osgood Wealth Partners is a real registered firm. Trey Osgood is a real licensed advisor, credentials checked out, no red flags on the surface. That part checked out exactly the way Renata had described it. But Priyanka had also found something Renata hadn't mentioned in her carefully rehearsed phone call to me. Osgood's firm had been named in a state regulatory complaint 2 years earlier, quietly settled, no admission of wrongdoing, involving unsuitable investment recommendations, specifically, at least one other client's inherited funds getting moved into high-fee proprietary products that primarily benefited the advisor's own commission structure rather than the client's actual returns. Not fraud, technically. Not something that would show up if you just Googled the guy's name casually over coffee. A pattern, though. A specific, ugly little pattern involving exactly the kind of money Marcus had. Here's where it gets more complicated instead of less, and I want to sit with that complication honestly instead of racing past it. Priyanka also found something about Renata's own history that reframed things again, in a direction I hadn't seen coming at all. 2 years before she met Marcus, Renata had gone through a divorce from a previous husband, something I genuinely hadn't known existed, and something Marcus, it turned out later, also hadn't fully known the details of. In the divorce filing, Renata's ex-husband had alleged, in a public court document, that she'd hidden marital assets in a business account registered under a friend's name during the separation. The case had been settled out of court, no admission of wrongdoing on either side, and most of the records were sealed except for the initial complaint, which happened to be technically public record in that county because of a filing quirk. I want to be honest about what finding this did to me, because it's not the clean vindication you'd expect from a Reddit post. It didn't make me feel right. It made me feel sick, actually, because up until that point some stubborn part of me had genuinely been hoping I'd find nothing, that Priyanka would call and say it was all fine, everything checked out, and I could just apologize to Marcus for overreacting and let the whole thing die quietly. Instead I had 2 separate, partially verified, still not fully conclusive threads pointing toward a pattern, and absolutely no idea how to hand any of it to my best friend without it looking, once again, like I'd built an entire secret case against his wife behind his back, which, functionally, at that point, I had, whether or not that had been my intention going in. The other piece of new information, and I think this is the one that actually complicates who's right here rather than simply confirming my suspicions further, came from Deb again. I found out that Marcus had known about at least part of the money situation for longer than he'd let on to any of us, including me. He'd noticed the account balance dropping himself, over a year before the birthday dinner. He'd asked Renata about it once, quietly, alone, no witnesses, and she'd cried, apparently, and told him she felt like he didn't trust her, like he was treating her like a suspect in her own marriage, and he'd backed off entirely rather than push through that discomfort. Which tracks exactly with everything Deb had told me about how he handles doubt about people he loves. He doesn't confront, he doesn't investigate, he just quietly chooses not to know, because knowing would require him to act, and Marcus does not like acting against people he's already decided to trust with his whole chest. That reframed my own behavior for me too, in a way I didn't love sitting with. I told myself, this entire time, that I was the one person willing to see clearly what nobody else wanted to say out loud. The lone rational actor in a family full of avoidance. But Marcus hadn't actually been blind this whole time. He'd been scared, in his own quiet, internal way, for at least a year before I ever printed a single page, and I'd shown up with evidence instead of a conversation, timed badly, in the one room of his house still saturated with his dead father's presence, which is maybe its own kind of avoidance dressed up as courage. Confronting the printed evidence had been easier for me than sitting with Marcus in his fear the way an actual, patient friend of 19 years probably should have. I called Priyanka back a few days later and asked her, point blank, whether she thought I'd done the right thing. She was quiet for a second and then said something I've turned over in my head a lot since. I think you found something real. I don't think that automatically means you found the right way to hand it to him. Those are 2 different tests and you only passed one of them. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me, just the 2 of us, no printed pages this time, nothing in my hands at all. He agreed, which surprised me. I think 6 weeks of silence had worn on him too, more than he'd let on to anyone in the family chat. We met at a diner we used to go to in high school, cracked vinyl booths, a menu that hadn't changed since we were 17, a neutral place that belonged to neither of our current lives, which felt important somehow. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since his dad's funeral, hollow around the eyes, a little unshaven, the specific exhaustion of someone who hasn't been sleeping in his own bed. First thing he said, before he'd even fully slid into the booth, was, "I need you to not start with the accountant stuff. Deb already told me about Priyanka's digging and I swear to God, Dale, if this is another ambush, I'm walking out before the coffee even gets here." "It's not an ambush. I'm not going to hand you anything today. No pages. I want to actually talk, that's it." He softened, a little, shoulders coming down maybe an inch, and said, "Okay." I told him what Deb had told me, that he'd known about the balance dropping himself, over a year ago, that he'd asked once and backed off when she cried. I watched his jaw tighten but he didn't deny any of it. He just stared down into his coffee for a long moment and said, "I didn't want to be the guy who doesn't trust his wife. My dad trusted people. That's who he was, and I always thought that was the thing I admired most about him, the way he just gave people the benefit of the doubt and didn't make a whole production out of every little suspicion." "Your dad also ran a business for 30 years, Marcus. He knew exactly how to read a number when something was wrong with it. That's not a contradiction of who he was, that's a skill he had that maybe you skipped learning because he was still around to do it for you. Not trusting a number isn't the same thing as not trusting a person. That's easy for you to say from outside the marriage, sitting there with your own perfectly stable savings account. You're right, it is easy for me to say. I'm not in it. But I'm not asking you to distrust her forever, Marcus. I'm asking you to actually look. Just look, with your own eyes, not mine, not Priyanka's, not some printed pages I handed you in a garage like a lawyer serving papers. If you look and it's all completely fine, then it's fine, and I will apologize to both of you, in person, genuinely, for how badly I handled bringing this to you. I mean that." He was quiet for a while, turning his coffee mug in slow half circles on the table. Then he said, "Lo, you embarrassed me. In my own garage. During my own birthday week. You didn't come to me first with a question, you came with proof, stapled and crooked, like I was a case you'd already built and closed before you ever knocked on my door. I know. I think that part was wrong of me, the way I did it, the timing, all of it. I don't think I was wrong to be worried, but I think I was wrong about how I handed it to you, and those are two different things I should have separated at the time and didn't. Those aren't separate things to me right now, Dale. Right now it doesn't feel like two different things. It feels like one single thing. My best friend of 19 years decided my wife was guilty before I ever got a say in the verdict. I didn't decide anything, Marcus. I found something I couldn't unsee, and I panicked about how to tell you, and I handled the telling badly. That's the actual truth of it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I handled it well, because I didn't. He didn't say it was okay. He didn't say I was forgiven, not that day, not in that booth. What he said instead was, I asked Renata for the full statements. All of them, every account, everything, the whole picture. She hasn't given them to me yet. It's been 4 days since I asked. That sentence sat between us on that cracked vinyl table for a long moment, heavier by far than anything I'd ever printed on 6 crumpled pages. What are you going to do, I asked carefully, if she keeps not giving them to you? He looked up at me then, and for the first time in the entire conversation his voice cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. I don't know. I really don't know, Dale. And I genuinely hate, that you're the reason I even have to sit here asking myself that question out loud. I didn't say anything to that. I don't think there was anything to say that wouldn't have made it worse. We sat there for a while longer, both of us staring at our coffee, the diner's old fluorescent lights humming overhead the exact same way they had when we were 17 and none of this existed yet. Before we left, he said one more thing, almost to himself, I keep thinking about what Dad would have done. And I don't actually know. I used to think I knew exactly what he would have done in every situation. I don't think I know that anymore. It's been about 5 weeks since that diner conversation. Here's where things actually stand, not the tidy version, the real one. Marcus and Renata are not divorced. They're also not, as far as I can tell from the outside, okay. He moved into the guest room about 3 weeks ago, his own words, not mine, when he finally told me over text, one flat sentence with no follow-up, after Renata produced only partial statements, missing 2 accounts entirely, and got visibly defensive when he pushed on the gap instead of simply explaining where the rest of the paperwork was. He hasn't hired a lawyer. He mentioned it once, in passing, on the phone, and then didn't bring it up again for 2 full weeks, and I've made myself not ask, because I think every time I ask about it now, it lands on him like pressure, even when that's genuinely not what I mean by asking. Renata, through the family grapevine, Deb, mostly, who has quietly become an unlikely and constant source of updates I never asked for but can't stop absorbing, has apparently told several people that I poisoned the marriage, and that Marcus is only doubting her now because his controlling friend group got in his head and turned him against her. I've heard, secondhand, that she's told Marcus more than once that if he really loved her, he'd stop letting his family and his oldest friend interrogate their finances like she's a suspect in her own home. I don't know how to feel about the fact that some small, uncomfortable part of me finds that framing almost convincing when I imagine hearing it from her, in the sense that I understand exactly why it would work on someone like Marcus, who has spent his entire life choosing the version of events that requires the least confrontation from him. Marcus and I are talking again, but it's different now, and I don't think that difference is going away anytime soon. There's a carefulness between us that wasn't there for 19 years. A beat of hesitation before either of us brings up anything remotely related to money, or trust, or Renata at all. He hasn't fully forgiven me for the garage, I don't think, even though he said the words, "I forgive you," out loud, once, over the phone, in a tone that didn't quite match the words. Deb told me last week that Marcus has started, quietly, moving what's left of the inheritance, down to about $95,000 now, less than a third of what Walt left him, into a new account that Renata doesn't have access to. That either means something is finally clicking into place for him, some instinct his father would have recognized, or it just means he's hedging while he decides whether he can actually live with not knowing the rest. I don't regret finding out what I found out. I do regret, deeply, how I handed it to him, cold, printed, badly timed, in the one room in his entire house that still had his dead father's fingerprints all over every surface, which in hindsight feels almost cruel, using that specific space to confront him with proof his father's money might be quietly disappearing. I've also had to sit with a smaller, uglier admission that doesn't fit neatly into either, I was right, or, I was wrong. Part of why I acted the way I did, showing up with printed pages instead of a phone call, letting it sit for 3 days instead of texting him the same night, was that some part of me had been waiting, quietly, for years, for a reason to be proven right about Renata. I didn't manufacture the emails. I didn't plant anything. But I recognize now that when I saw that laptop screen, there was a flicker of something underneath the worry that felt almost like relief, like finally, and I don't love what that says about how I'd been carrying this resentment toward her long before I had any real evidence to justify it. Ines pointed this out to me gently, maybe a month into all of this, and I got defensive about it for about a day before I had to admit she wasn't wrong. Deb and I talk more now than we used to, which is its own strange side effect of all this. She calls maybe once a week, ostensibly for updates, though I think at this point it's become more of a standing habit than a need for information. Last week she told me something I hadn't considered, that watching this play out has made her think back on her own marriage to Walt differently, wondering how many small warning signs either of them chose not to look at over 30-some years, and whether every long marriage just has a version of this buried somewhere in it, visible or not. I didn't know what to do with that comment except sit with it. So here's my honest question, the one I still argue with myself about at 2 in the morning some nights, lying awake next to Ines who has heard every version of this story so many times she can probably recite it back to me at this point. Was I the asshole for how I did it, even if I turn out not to have been wrong about what I actually found? Ines thinks I did the only thing a real friend of 19 years could have done, full stop, no qualifiers. Deb thinks I should get some kind of medal for finally saying what she'd wanted to say for years and couldn't. Marcus, when I asked him directly, sitting in that diner booth, just looked at me for a long moment and said, "I don't know yet, Dale. Ask me again in a year," and I think that might honestly be the most truthful answer anyone has given me through this entire mess. AITA. #edit. A lot of people asked what happened with the 2 missing accounts, so here's an update from this week, about 6 weeks after I originally wrote this out. Priyanka, still quietly digging at this point, mostly, I think, because she finds the puzzle itself professionally interesting rather than out of any remaining obligation to the family drama, found that one of the two missing accounts wasn't hidden money at all in the way any of us had assumed. It was a joint account Renata had opened with her sister roughly 2 years earlier to help cover their mother's memory care facility costs, something Renata had apparently never told Marcus about because, in her words when he finally confronted her directly, she didn't want him to feel obligated to help pay for it, given how much of his own inheritance had already gone toward their household by that point. That part, if it's true, and I want to be careful here, because at this stage I genuinely can't independently verify it, only report what Marcus told me, actually complicates things again in a direction I didn't expect. It's the first piece of this entire saga that reads less like extraction and more like a private, maybe misguided, act of pride on Renata's part, the kind of thing you could imagine someone doing out of shame rather than deception. It doesn't erase the Trey Osgood emails. It doesn't explain the second account, which is still fully unaccounted for as of this week. But it's the first genuinely humanizing thing to surface in 6 weeks of this getting steadily uglier, and I think it matters that I include it rather than just the parts that make my read on all of this look cleaner. The second account is still unexplained. Marcus hasn't decided what to do with either piece of information yet, and honestly, neither have I. I keep waiting for this whole thing to resolve into a clean story where someone's clearly the villain and someone's clearly the hero, and it just hasn't, not once, not at any point along the way, and at this point I've mostly stopped expecting it to happen at all. If anything changes in a way that actually resolves this, I'll post another update. I'm not holding my breath.